Good. So I'm Dirk Forrester, and I'm pleased to have sort of an annual role in moderating this session to talk about sort of the dreams and ambitions of pursuing cooperation across North America. It's always an interesting ride, lots of twists and turns. I think when we met a year ago, we were talking about sort of a thriving international linkage between provinces in Canada, state of California. We were talking about new legislation that was then pending in Mexico that might create conditions for harmonized programs that might link at some point in the future. We were looking at sort of how the North America or the U.S. fabric might evolve, what kind of state-level activities might have more of these international linkages. And we were talking about Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. It was a topic of intense negotiation all through last year. It was one that was supposed to be part of the package of rules agreed in Katowice in Poland at the end of the year. But as you all know from the headlines, it was the one piece that was sort of left off because they couldn't reach agreement on some of the accounting standards around Article 6. Mm-hmm. Also, they couldn't reach agreement on exactly how to set up the new mechanism, kind of the new and improved offsetting mechanism that we would formally think of as the CDM. So it means that as we come here today, we've got Article 6 still on the table. It might even be the prime issue for negotiation this year. There are a couple of other important ones, but it's going to get more senior level attention. There's good and bad in that, but it does mean that it's one of the main agenda items for the COP coming up in December in Santiago, Chile. And similarly, we've also seen governmental change in Mexico. So we've got new leadership in Mexico. I think we'll hear about whether the issue is as partisan in Mexico as it is in the United States. I think not. Seems to be more agreement on the need to act on climate change. But we'll get caught up on that. And also, we're moving through elections in Canada, both provincial level, but building up toward elections in the autumn, federal elections in Canada, and it means that the climate issue will get a level of discourse there that you only get in election years, right? Mm-hmm. So meanwhile, in the United States, also our elections are already beginning, the discussions at the federal level, and again, this will be an issue that if you listen to candidates talk, that I think it'll be a prime issue for the elections next year in the United States. So we're going to try to explore these topics, but first I sort of thought we'd get started with a bit of a catch-up on each of we're going to start north to south. So I'm going to start with Larry Hogan from Vironment Canada to talk with us about the state of play in Canada, what's exciting you, what's worrying you, what do you see as like the main priorities for carbon pricing in Canada, because there's some really interesting things happening there. So Larry, catch us up. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Dirk, and thank you to Climate Action Reserve for inviting me to be on the panel, and it's a pleasure to be here in Los Angeles. I'm a bit new to this whole carbon markets world, having focused more on sort of other negotiating issues than the UNFCCC. But and the reason I mentioned that is because this conference yesterday, and I'm sure going forward, has been absolutely fascinating for me in terms of really being a policy wonk who works in the international climate issues, which are very sort of high level, move slowly, and it's been a real pleasure to come to a conference here and really meet the practitioners of carbon pricing systems, where California really is linked with Quebec, and Canada is really at the forefront of advancing an effective carbon pricing system. And in terms of cooperation and sort of giving an update, I'd just like to say, there has been a lot of, I think, advancement in cooperation internationally and North America, even in the last 6 to 8 months. And actually reflecting on what I learned yesterday, I'd just like to say, we had an election and a change of government in the province of Quebec in the last less than a year. and yet Quebec still remains solidly in the WCI. So I'd like to say, from like an internal sort of partnership coordination within Canada, that's a good development, and that does reflect that the federal government over the last few months, in fact, has advanced our commitment to ensure that we put a price on carbon pollution throughout Canada, and that came into effect in 2019. And that has required the federal government to work in cooperation with our subnational governments. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the federal carbon pricing system because I have some colleagues from Canada who are going to be on a panel after this, Path 2, 11 o'clock. We're going to go into a lot more detail on the federal carbon pricing system. I have a colleague of mine from Environment and Climate Change Canada, and I have colleagues from the Nova Scotia government and the Quebec government who will speak to that. But that is definitely a big advancement in the last couple of months in Canada in terms of cooperation within Canada. In terms of cooperation internationally, which is more of the space I've been exposed to, I would like to emphasize that for example, just since the last September when we had the GCAS summit in California, there's been international cooperation, and I'd like to start with the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees that Dirk mentioned at the beginning of the session today, and that is a huge endeavor by scientists from all around the world, and Canada is proud to have had our scientists contribute to that report. And certainly the government of Canada welcomes that report, and we recognize the sort of scientific consensus that report has showed in terms of the need for urgent action. And certainly we see the IPCC as a valuable and credible and independent source of scientific information that is very important for informing policy, climate policy going forward. But also it's important for informing this sort of the communication that's going on in Canada, the communication discourse with the public about understanding the climate challenge, the gravity of it, the enormity of it, but also reflecting on a comment that was made in the previous panel about how it's not just about a temperature increase, it's really about other impacts as well. And in Canada, we're seeing that in terms of changes to ice and snow coverage, and particularly up in our northern communities where we have sort of vulnerable communities, and particularly our Indigenous communities. I will just sort of also highlight, before I limit my initial comments here, in terms of international cooperation, as you mentioned, there was at COP24, parties cooperated, including Canada, to reach agreement on a Paris rulebook implementation package. And I say a package because, as has been mentioned, a key element missing from that guidance is the guidance on Article 6 that will set the framework for international emissions trading. And that is something that Canada has been fairly active and out front in sort of trying to advance those negotiations towards ensuring that the framework that we hope does get established and reach agreement on in COP25 in San Diego, and is certainly a priority for Canada, ensures that there's a lot of integrity, environmental integrity to the system, which of course is paramount to making sure that there's confidence in future international emissions trading systems. So I'll just sort of leave it at that in terms of where I see updated international cooperation, where I sit, and pass it on.
Yeah, I think that I'm glad you kind of brought it back to the 1.5 degree goal. So we don't know how to get to 2 degrees yet. Working really hard to get to 2 degrees, but it does sort of feel like somebody moved the goalpost, and like the whole international conversation's much more focused on 1.5 degrees. And in some respects, I think that puts a lot more pressure on Article 6 to deliver, because you look at that IPCC report, there's no pathway to get there that isn't using nature-based offsets in a huge way. There's no pathway to getting there that's, it taps into CCS in huge way. So if we're actually going to keep those pathways open, we really need Article 6 to come through and to actually deliver that kind of integrity, which you don't have to tell this room about it, because these are people that live and breathe and invest around it here in California. So I'm going to move next to Angela, because we're moving north to south, if that's okay. And Angela is our surrogate United States person here with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Can give us a flavor of how you see the issues positioned across the U.S. right now.
Sure. Well, it hasn't been a fun place to work in Washington the last couple of years if you're working on climate change. We've been spending a lot of time working on defense, and the Clean Power Plan was one of the first targets of repeal and rollback of this administration, along with a variety of other aspects of the Obama climate plan. They are right now, all of those regulations are in court, so we haven't completely lost. But it's depressing nonetheless. And even if we were to win in court, given that IPCC report and what we've seen happen around the globe and in the country in terms of the intensity of climate impacts, it's way too modest. It's not nearly ambitious enough. So even if we were to survive, we would need a lot more ambitious policy. So we've continued to work to really preserve the opportunity for a regulatory framework. There's been a lot of attempts not only just to repeal the actual policy, but the underpinnings of regulatory of policy, the changing the way you do cost-benefit analysis so that things like clean air and health protections don't count when you're looking at climate policy. That was embedded in the latest repeal of the Mercury rule. So there's a lot of insidious activity underway, at least there has been the last couple of years, but we had an election in this country as well, and that flipped control of the House of Representatives to the Democrats and to many of them climate champions. We've seen in the last, 3 months, 28 hearings in the House of Representatives on climate, more in the last 3 months than in the last decade. The one thing that I found really interesting about those hearings is when you look at how the Republicans have questioned witnesses and what their behavior has been in hearings, not rarely, I think there's one fairly magnified episode of climate denial, but most of the time, they didn't deny the science of climate change. They talked about American innovation. They talked about the need to do things economically. So some of that has given me a little bit more hope. There's also been a tremendous amount of activity in the states, obviously, that I think is also having an impact on the way Congress views these issues. The move towards 100% clean energy, which, by the way, polls out of the park, even if folks are divided on climate, there's a lot of very bipartisan support around clean energy. And so there's that. And then, of course, there was a very publicized and kind of unexpected Green New Deal that came as a result of the last elections. And obviously, I hate just shortening her name, but AOC, leadership in that is notable. But really the youth energy behind it, I think, is what has really captivated a lot of the country. And the intensity of their demands, the ambition of that plan, it has really brought a very different dimension to the discussion of climate policy that I think is going to be ultimately quite beneficial. And I think it's worth noting that Senator Markey co-sponsored that resolution in the Senate. And the difference between what the resolution actually says and the way the Green New Deal gets portrayed is quite striking. It's worth taking a look at. In the midst of all of that, obviously, we continue to see the movement of carbon pricing, carbon tax bills. They're being reintroduced, coupled with Republican co-sponsors. So there's some interesting movement around carbon pricing and carbon tax. I think it's going to be a really interesting kind of the open question for discussion, I think, is whether or not cap and trade or carbon tax was just so besmirched by the last climate policy debate, which I can't believe is over a decade ago now, or right at a decade, that it's going to be hard for it to play a role, or figuring out who champions it. Maybe it becomes the market-based alternative, whereas many of the other climate advocates are advocating for the kinds of things the Union of Concerned Scientists has been promoting for years, which is to say that the complementary policies around clean energy, around fuel economy standards, and now particularly we're very invested in modernizing the grid. Even if we were to get 100% clean energy tomorrow, our grid couldn't deliver that. So we have a lot of changes we have to make to the infrastructure of our energy delivery system. We think we can make some progress on those things in the next couple of years, even under this administration. So I'm anxious to talk a little bit about some of the smaller kind of foundational policies we think can really help set the stage for a new Congress and potentially a new president in 2020.
Yeah, so you see the conversation federally as slightly more positive in the United States, given the changeover in the House, but how do you see it shaping up as an election issue? Do you think it'll rise to a top tier, or it always feels like climate ends up on the back burner, which is one of the challenges of it?
You know, it's really interesting. I think during the primaries, it will be top tier. There's no question that the candidates are anxious to talk about it, either in the Green New Deal frame or in extreme weather events, or there's just a lot of pent-up enthusiasm, I think, on the Democratic side to talk about it. On the other side, what you saw with Majority Leader McConnell, sort of pushing the Green New Deal for a vote in the Senate, I think is indicative of the fact that the Republicans may see bashing climate as something they want to do. And so it might be a very polarizing debate, but I think we'll see more, it'll be more of an issue than it has been in the past.
Okay, thank you. Sandra Guzman, thank you for, you quickly joined our panel this morning. We were delighted to have someone from Semarnat here. So the Semarnat is the Environment Ministry in Mexico, and you've got responsibilities for this very set of things. So bring us up to speed on the new government and kind of how you are approaching the set of issues around carbon pricing, market opportunities, and also, if you don't mind, touching on this question of partisanship and how that plays in a Mexican context.
Perfect. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor to be here on behalf of the Environmental Ministry in Mexico. As you said, we had elections and therefore a new government that started last December. And of course, there are thousands of questions about what is going to happen with the climate policy, what is going to happen with the carbon market. And what I can tell you is that this government is fully committed with the international commitments that we had internationally, not only on climate change, biodiversity, with the Agenda 2030. We are working hard, not only within the environmental sector, because we are working a lot with all the institutions that are part of the environmental sector, but also with other ministries. We have been working a lot with the urban and rural agriculture development ministry, also with all the agricultural ministry. I mean, we have been working with different actors at the national level. And what I can tell you is that now, after a few months, we are fully in a planning process, internalizing all of these commitments. What is gonna, for instance, you were mentioning, we have been thinking a lot what means in the context of a country like Mexico, where we place ourselves when we talk about the 1.5. So we have been discussing, we have been debating about how we are going to deal with this, because we have a huge package. And we were saying, like, we have 11 years to cut, like, rapidly emissions, and 6 of those 11 years are in this administration. So that's why we have been discussing seriously what is going to happen, how we have to coordinate, because we know that it's something that we are not going to solve only within the environmental ministry, but we have to take out all of these agendas. We have to work with different actors. So we have been defining the priorities for mitigation, the adaptation side, and for sure, one of the key elements that we want to strengthen is the work with local states, with subnational states, like states and municipalities, because as you know, most of the actions have to take place at the territorial level. In that sense, I would like to share with you that in this process to design the National Development Plan. We have been working hard, and we managed to include a cross-cutting line about sustainable development and territory. So what we want to do is really bring all of these environmental issues within the different agendas. But not only that, we are highly focused in how we are going to strengthen our policies to actually build capacities, but also make social changes. As you know, part of the key priorities of this government is to reduce poverty, reduce the inequalities. And for us, it's really important that all the designs, all the policies that we are going to design have to be able to demonstrate that we are having changes at the social level. So that's why we are really committed with the sustainable agenda in general, not only from the environmental perspective, of course, the economic perspective, but for us, the social benefit side is highly important. In that sense, of course, there are thousands of questions about the carbon market, what is going to happen, are you going to push it or not? And I can tell you that yes. The plan in the last administration was to start a pilot program of the carbon market at the beginning of this year, but we really wanted to explore and to understand better, but particularly we wanted to strengthen the rules of this pilot program. Why? Because we truly believe that this pilot program shouldn't be a game, shouldn't be a simulation. We need to start building capacities. We need to start hard policies to say, okay, even though it is going to be a pilot program, if you don't comply, there will be consequences. Probably not economic consequences at this stage, but there should be consequences, because at the end of the day, you want to have a tool that will encourage other companies and other sectors to be part of the reduction of emissions. And at the end of the day, will bring also other positive externalities. So if you really want to participate, we need to start talking about this in a serious way. So that's why we wanted to do like a revise of the rules. The pilot program will start next year, in January next year, and we will publish the rules of the system in basically 3 weeks. So we are working hard with different actors, with different sectors, of course the private sector, but also with other non-governmental organizations that will have to follow up, we'll have to track the results of this. And of course, we are working with different actors within the environmental sector. For instance, what is going to happen with the offsets policies in the forest. And so we have been working with different actors, like opening the discussion, because as you know, this system is part of the law, of the climate change law. So it's something that is public. So we cannot just work with a group of actors. We have to open the discussion and say, okay, how we are going to deal with this, because as you can imagine, we are new, no? In many ways. Not only the companies that are going to be part, few of them are participating in international markets, so they more or less know how this works, but pretty much most of the companies that will be part of the system are new in this. So we have to work a lot creating capacities, building this confidence, because at the end of the day, it's confidence between the government and companies that we have to work together, because we know that we are not going to solve this only from the governmental perspective and neither from the private sector. So we have to work together, and this is exactly what we are trying to do, build this confidence and say, this goes, but we have to be serious in how we are going to operate, even if it is the first part of the pilot project. According to the law, the pilot program has to, it's more or less for 36 months. And what we have been working is, okay, let's work in the pilot program for 24 months, and then let's take 12 months to start the transition. Because what we want to do is really strengthening the capacities and to be able to start this more or less like quick, because we know that we don't have enough time to lose. So the next steps, as I said, is we are going to publish the rules of the pilot program. And this year we are going to focus a lot in the design of the registry, no? Because if we are going to have a pilot program, you need like something like to start exchanges, to start the conversation. So we are going to be working a lot in the design of the registry. That's why I'm also here, because I want to learn more about how other systems work. And we really want to have something that is very applicable to Mexico, but also with this idea to connect with other international markets eventually. And of course, we're going to work a lot in the offsets program. Like we know that there are a lot of discussions that we need to have still, so it's not solved. And of course, one of the key elements is work building capacities, not only from the regulation side, but also from the participant side. And as I said, keep building confidence to say, this goes, we are committed, it's a new government, but we are fully committed and we really want to do this and we want to have something that is efficient and that it has impact. We don't want to have policies that don't have impact. So that's why we are also working a lot in the means of implementation. So how we are going to have these policies, how we are going to implement, how we are going to bring all the different actors, and how we are going to really make a change in the 6 years that we have. So.
Excellent. Well, so you gave a good sense there of, that's a great overview. I want to come back, and maybe I'm going to ask each of you about this a little bit. And by the way, I'm coming to you guys for questions and like just after my one set of questions, okay? So get your ideas and ready. So you talked about involvement of communities and also talked about this sort of offsets and the forestry role. Is that something you see coming into play at the outset? I mean, because there's similarly the CORSIA conversation happening where those asset classes are being looked at with a lot of interest. How do you see all of that playing out, again, in the Mexican context?
Yes, you know, this is a conversation that has been like going on for a while already. What we are really trying to work, for instance, with the forest sector, as you know, one of the key issues is who owns the carbon, no? Who has the property of the carbon reduction? Is the community, is the government, who is it? And I think one of the key elements that we really want to do is work in the law, in the legal framework that we have, to start defining better the type of ownership. And also we are, of course, we are also putting a cap. The offsets are only 10%, and otherwise we are going to start trying to compensate our emissions everywhere and not really reducing, and it's not what we want. So that's why we are having these discussions. Of course, in the forest sector, there are a lot of interest. But one of the key elements is how to ensure that these offsets, that these compensation programs comply not only from the environmental integrity point of view, but also from the social point of view. We have people living in the forest, and for us it's really important to respect that, that we cannot deny. And of course for them is the fact that we have so many forests conserved is thanks to the people that live there. So we have to have a deeper debate about how we are going to bring all of these kind of discussions that have been taking place in the past to this discussion, and how we are going to respect that if we have a compensation program, but also how we are going to use other tools. And in the later, we have a session later at 2:30 about this carbon market in Mexico, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we see also the interaction of this system with other policies, for instance, the carbon tax or the climate change fund that we have also to invest in mitigation and adaptation actions. And for instance, forest is always like how we are going to bring all of these sectors, key sectors to all of this debate, how we are going to regulate, but ensure that the actions that we take are going to be respectful of this. So it's an ongoing debate, and this year we are going to do some consultations also thanks to the National Commission of Forests that it has been working with us all of these weeks about debating how we're going to do that. No? But it's something that we really want to explore in the next year or so.
Because I know that, I think that's been, again, a valuable learning from the California program is sort of the role that plays, and also sort of some of the tribal communities' involvement in California. It's been really innovative and interesting. So I'm sure you're going to get like 15 people approach you after this session. You're going to have the registry people. You're going to, anyway, but thank you for that.
Thank you.
I want to maybe, Angela, give you a chance to talk a little bit about how you see, so the U.S. so far is still part of CORSIA, I think, and there's work going on and drawing lessons from the experiences on offsets. So how is UCS seeing that side of things in U.S. federal policy making? Because you never get anywhere at the federal level, at least all my years in Washington, if you can't get the farm states on board, you never get out of the Senate. So how are you guys looking at it?
So there's a lot. I appreciate that you mentioned that the IPCC report shows that we really are going to need negative emissions carbon removal to reach those climate goals. And it's really spearheaded a very interesting conversation in Washington. The National Academy of Sciences just put out a report about, probably coming up on a year ago now, looking at various sources of negative emissions technologies. Obviously, the natural solutions like preserving forests, soil sequestration, and blue carbon are some of the most immediate and achievable, easily achieved sources of carbon removal. Those issues of measurement are still important. The issues of equity and ownership, really, really critical, and something we care a lot about, and accounting. And I should also mention that what's really intriguing to me is the ag piece. There's a movement afoot that is referred to as healthy soils. It's more resilient. It's talking about ways to both increase the resiliency of soils by keeping the carbon in. In essence, there's more to it than that, obviously. But I think they're really taking a very different tack than 10 years ago and really going at the ag community as we want you to be part of the solution and we're going to pay you to be part of the solution. That's part of it. But it's really very much in the mode of profitability for farmers, being able to withstand the changes that are happening in the climate and making it really having soil sequestration be something that they do as a means to preserve their crops. And so there's exactly how you pair that with climate policy. We're not quite there yet, but there's a very robust discussion about healthy soils and how to use either existing or new programs to achieve those goals.
So, coming back to Canada then on this topic, I know there's work underway on sort of getting a federal level offset program, and I'm assuming that it will eventually look at these asset classes. I guess there's a bit of a CORSIA gleam in the eye, but there's also the federal backstop and what entities that are involved in that, what kind of what access they'll have to offset markets. Do you want to give us a little update on sort of where that set of issues is positioned right now?
Sure, and it's going to be brief because we only just announced like last month that
it's not done yet.
Only that we will sort of be instigating an offset program as part of the compliance to the broader federal system for putting a price on pollution. And we're at the stage now of the federal government will be going out and consulting with provinces, territorial governments, but also with indigenous peoples, and recognizing that there is a need, as we discussed it's been discussed here, to engage at a sort of local community. And as I mentioned before, indigenous peoples are a very key local community from the federal perspective. So no comment on sort of how certain asset classes might be considered as part of that offset system. Maybe my colleague Amber will get further into the details of in the breakout session, path 2, 11 o'clock. But certainly, maybe just a segue there that this with a sort of very sort of fluid, let's say, political environment in North America. The federal government has definitely sort of evolved in terms of when it's engaging with stakeholders. There's a sense of importance of going to at the local level, to the subnational level, and also engaging with civil society and indigenous peoples. And our broader sort of national climate plan, that's the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. Part of that, for example, has a commitment to, as that plan is rolled out, which includes a price on carbon, but includes a lot of other complementary measures for mitigation, adaptation, and also for incentivizing clean growth and clean jobs, is to have ongoing discussions, tables with Indigenous peoples from Canada on how to implement all those measures, not just emissions pricing. And that is a very significant commitment in Canada, and it's part of the federal government's overall commitment to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. So there's a very strong and important nexus between reconciliation of Indigenous peoples and climate change, and that is a core to our sort of more our engagement that does reach out to sort of more of a local level within Canada. And maybe just a segue there, because up until a couple of weeks ago, my full-time job as a negotiator for Canada and the UNFCCC was recognizing that this engagement with Indigenous peoples, local communities, has to happen at an international level. And in the Paris decision back in 2015, parties did commit to strengthening the knowledge, technologies, practices, innovations of local communities, Indigenous peoples, and they established something called a Local Communities Indigenous Peoples Platform. It took 3 years, almost up to COP24 of negotiations, to actually launch the operationalization of that platform, which brings Indigenous peoples together with parties to discuss climate policy, discuss the work of the UNFCCC, not in a bubble, but actually with a mandate to have linkages to the other work of the UNFCCC. And that is something that Canada was very proud to be sort of on the forefront of advocating for sort of real meaningful engagement that goes beyond just the sort of traditional party-to-party engagement under the UNFCCC at the UNFCCC. Yeah, and I could go on for a lot about that, but I'll stop there.
I'm glad you did, because it gives it's a little flavor of one of the very positive things that happened in Katowice, because this was the place where, at the end of the talks, on a rule book, which is, can you think of anything more boring to negotiate than a rule book?
Yeah.
But at the end of it, this is the part where you got like indigenous people celebrating in song, and it was actually really a great moment in Katowice. So congratulations on that. And now your job is to get that for Article 6, and we want a song as well. Okay, so I'm going to open the floor. I think, Craig, do we have a microphone, or do you want him to shout out? We can shout out. I think there might be a spare microphone, but has anybody got a question? We have about 10 minutes, according to the green sign down here. Who's got a question? Because I can start calling on people in the audience. That's another way we can do this. Okay, Craig. And you do have a microphone. Turn the man on.
We hear a lot about working lands and the role they can play, and you know, there's a lot of discussion about carbon capture and sequestration. Most of that discussion focuses around high-tech options and solutions. Got a lot of engineers and chemists working on it, but there's one option we know how to absorb carbon, and that's planting trees in any way, shape, or form. And I guess my question is, what are the key policies that are being implemented now, and how do we significantly enhance ambition in the natural working land sector to really make a difference and hopefully buy humanity some time to address the climate impacts?
Who wants to take that?
Well,
Angela? Yeah?
you know, it's a real challenge, and at the same time, you know, trees are our best way to capture carbon, and wildfires are going after them, right? So it's really right at the intersection of climate impacts and climate solutions. We did a little bit of work at UCS trying to figure out what more could we do domestically on forests. And as it turns out, there's a tremendous, most of it is obviously government-owned lands in the West can be managed differently. And I know California is in a robust conversation about that right now because of the wildfire discussion. In Alaska, there's a carbon sink that's seriously at risk in the boreal forest there. On the East Coast, though, it's all of that. Those trees are in private hands, and there's some pretty interesting policy development that could be done looking at. I love these acronyms, TIMOs and REITs. You all probably know more about those than I do. But there are essentially a lot of those lands held in trusts, and there are some really interesting, I think, potential in terms of tax incentives that could encourage reforestation and better management of those private lands.
A Mexican?
Yes. Yes, definitely. I think this is one of the key elements. And actually, within the environmental sector, we have been thinking a lot because, you know, we have to reduce emissions in the energy sector, in the transport sector. When we think about forests and when we think the opportunities that we have, not only reforesting, but actually conserving what we have, And this is actually one of the priorities in the environmental sector. We had set this not only, as I said, in terms of trying to build more capacities in terms of reforesting, like around and across the country, but also a stronger conservation policy, not only in our forests, but particularly in our natural protected areas. We have been discussing this because it's one of the things, if we can do something in the next 6 years, we know that is regarding forests and, well, pretty much in transport. But we have been thinking how we are going to start also counting this for the compliance. As you know, we have a goal to have zero deforestation in 2030, which is quite ambitious. And we are not only revising the goal itself, but actually trying to make an effort to see how we are going to do important changes in the next 6 years to ensure that our forest is conserved, and how we are going to start how we are going to use these mechanisms like the carbon market and others to actually invest in that conservation, like encouraging communities and other parts of the population to build this. And actually the president had wanted to publish a program, which is Sembrando Vida, which is a reforestation program that aims to reforest with fruit trees all around the country. And he's like really, obviously he always considers in our meetings, he's always like, I'm an environmentalist. And because people is like, he doesn't speak about climate change, he never mentioned environment, but he considers himself an environmentalist. And he's like putting this reforestation program as well, thinking in how we are going to improve like the ecosystems and the landscapes in many states. But I think like we are working in these different layers, like, but also forest for us is definitely an important sector to work on it.
Just to add, of course, in Canada, the forest sector is a very, very important sector. Much of the management of the forest is at the provincial jurisdiction. The terms of sort of like federal climate policy and incentives to sort of harness forests as part of climate action. Of course, I can't go too much into our federal offset program and that implications, but I'm sure that it's part of the consultations, those sort of, the role of forest, no doubt would be considered.
If it's not already, we'll make sure it is.
No doubt. But just to mention, like the federal backstop for that is being implemented, I mean, that will apply to facilities, emitters in the forest sector, like for example, in the pulp and paper sector, whatnot. Certainly, in terms of our national climate plan, which has an emphasis on emphasizing technology development, there's a recognition that as Canada, as a sort of, with a strong forestry sector, there's certainly opportunities and the federal government does have a role in promoting research and development in the forest sector that also addresses the climate emissions. And then sort of segueing to the sort of international angle, and I mentioned it, want to mention here, it is be remiss for me to not, because Canada, remiss for me not to mention just how integrated Canada's economy is with the US and with Mexico. And in the last, I think only 6-7 months, we have had I call it the Canada-US-Mexico Free Trade Agreement, although it might be called by others the US-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement. And that's a very important agreement. And it does have an environment chapter. And because I was jet lagged and couldn't sleep last night, I actually looked up and did a word search on that environment chapter. And not a big surprise, climate change didn't come up. But it does have Article 24.23, a sustainable forest management and trade clause in the environment chapter, and it interestingly talks about how parties to this agreement, but yes, still has to be ratified, acknowledge the importance of, I've just got it here, the critical role of forests in providing numerous ecosystem services, including carbon storage. So there is that acknowledgement in, for example, in the environment chapter of a free trade agreement, which does have that role for, and you know, maybe is a pathway to further collaboration and cooperation in this domain.
Yeah, that's interesting. And there's, I think, also potential work on this through the carbon pricing in the Americas grouping, because there's some great successes at the provincial level in Canada that I know have been looked at by others across South America, and Colombia now has a really vibrant kind of forest component to their tax and offset system. So some interesting lessons to draw upon. Do I have another question? Yes, Andrea. Introduce yourself. Andrea Tuttle.
Thank you, Dirk, and thanks to everybody on the panel. A very good discussion that you had. My question is really for Angela on the U.S. side. I heard that Senator Chris Van Hollen and another congressional member have introduced a very simple cap and dividend bill. And it's very straightforward. It doesn't have offsets. It's a cap and dividend. And I'm wondering, why now? What do you think the future of it might be? And you know, any hope? Is it just to open a conversation, or what do you know about the bill, and what do you think it's going to achieve?
You know, I think this is a reintroduction. He introduced this in the previous Congress as well. I would refer to a wonderful resource that C2ES, I can forget what their acronym stands for now. Used to be the Pew Center on Global Climate Change. But they did a really wonderful overview of last year's climate bills, carbon pricing bills in the Senate, and the Van Hollen bill is in the mix. And what that particular fact sheet does a great job of really is distinguishing the different features of the various bills. So, you know, yeah, I think people are putting out a lot of really good ideas and different policy design approaches. There's another one called the Energy Innovation and Climate and Carbon Dividend bill that has co-sponsored, I think it was, forgetting the primary sponsor, but the two Republican sponsors, it essentially is the Curbelo bill that has been reintroduced but with Fitzpatrick and some other Republicans on it. So there's probably 6 or 8 that are coming down the pike. The use of revenues, whether it's dividend or reinvestment or in other areas, a White House bill obviously does, White House has a carbon tax bill that would be reinvested in the economy. So I think what all of these folks are doing is basically trying to lay out some policy design ideas, and I do think it's pretty interesting that it is quite possible that the market mechanisms will become a more conservative approach to tackling climate when and hopefully when we get down to serious legislating.
Thank you for that. I think our time is up. I guess did you see another hand out there?
Sorry,
Okay. I'll do one more.
Sorry, maybe you can make it brief. This is for Canada and Mexico. I know you're still in the beginning stages of developing the forest offset protocols, but I was wondering how different will they be from California's protocols? Is there anything you're planning on doing differently?
Did everybody hear the question? Like looking at California's forest offset protocols, and will yours be different? What are you allowed to say?
Well, first of all, we're going to have a session about the carbon market today, 2:40. Sorry that I'm going to clash. Yeah. But and we are going to be able to talk a little bit more about this. But definitely, we have an agreement with California to look into these elements that we can learn from the program. So, but definitely, we can discuss later a little bit more of the details.
Yeah. And in Canada?
Well, no, I mean, not in a position to talk about specific protocols for a system that's really, in a compliance system that's very nascent stages.
Yeah. But you've also got like domestic provincial forest offset protocols to examine. You got a lot to examine.
Yes, we do. And maybe just a segue back into my international sphere is that as part of Canada's climate financing commitments, we do provide funding to, I think, a World Bank facility, which actually also is investing in forest-based initiatives. And from there, I think there's a hope that there can be sort of some lessons learned, and also sort of some investments that could, go down the road towards at least strengthening sort of the international potential use of foreign offsets under a framework that will hopefully soon to be approved at COP25 for Article 6.
Yeah, hopefully. So I hope this gives you a bit of an update then on sort of what's happening across the Americas, and you get the sense that the market trends are continuing, a lot of work to do across the board. But it is a prize worth fighting for, and we're going to hopefully, Craig, come back next year and be able to talk about the successes of Article 6 and getting that accomplished. One thing so you've had 2 shameless plugs, right? You've had the shameless plug on the Mexican event later, on the Canadian discussion later. But one of the things that we at IETA are working on this year with Professor Jay Edmonds at the University of Maryland is some economic modeling on Article 6. And I know economic modeling is close to your heart, Craig, but it's really interesting when you look at the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees, there's, in a sense, not scenarios in there about Article 6 because it relied a lot on modeling that was done before Article 6 existed. So understanding what the potential is, so the early indications are, as you might expect, it could either enable a lot more ambition or save us a lot of money to inspire people to take more ambition in the future. So stay tuned, and we'll be talking more about that over the course of the year. It's been a great discussion. Thanks to all the panelists. Join me in giving them a round of applause.